Hold on. The Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on unmasking the hidden crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women, exploring solutions to end the cycle of violence. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Good morning to you all and a warm welcome to our witnesses today. Today we'll be confronting a deeply troubling and disturbing situation affecting Indian country nationwide, the hidden crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. A 2016 National Institute of Justice report noted that 1.5 million American Indian and Alaska Native women experience violence in their lifetime. On reservations, American Indian and Alaska Native women experience murder rates 10 times the national average. Additionally, independent report found at least 5,712 cases of missing or murdered Indigenous women that were reported just in 2016. In reality, these numbers are much larger because Indigenous women are often underrepresented in national and local data. A lack of comprehensive data to quantify the number of missing and murdered women in Indian country is just one factor contributing to this crisis. The witnesses we have here today will attest to many other factors that exacerbate this situation, including the following: extreme jurisdictional challenges in our criminal justice system leading to confusion, delays, and lack of prosecution, and inadequate resources for tribal justice systems. Before we begin, I'd like to share with you all just a few of the heartbreaking cases that have brought new attention to this situation in Indian country, and that highlight some of the failures of our current system. Ashley Loring Heavy Runner was last seen in June 2017 on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. Her family and friends spent a year searching for her on their own. In February 2018, 9 months after Ashley went missing, the Federal Bureau of Investigation finally joined the search. To this day, even with the help of the FBI, Ashley still remains missing. In 2013, Mackenzie Howard, a 13-year-old villager from Cake, Alaska, went missing after a memorial ceremony. After her body was found behind a local church, it took 11 hours for state troopers to finally arrive, during which time the village men guarded Mackenzie's body and the crime scene throughout the night. In 2016, Ashlyn Mike, an 11-year-old Navajo girl, was found dead after being tricked into accepting a ride home from a stranger while playing after school on the Navajo reservation. Because of jurisdictional issues, an official Amber Alert for Ashlyn wasn't issued until 12 hours after her disappearance. According to a study on child abductions by the Washington State Attorney General's office, 76% of kidnapped children are killed within the first 3 hours. In 2017, Savannah Graywind, a 22-year-old member of the Spirit Lake tribe, went missing in Fargo, North Dakota. Savannah was 8 months pregnant. Her brutal attack and murder were perpetuated by a neighbor, and her body was found 8 days later by a kayaker near the Red River, north of Fargo. I know these stories are hard to hear. Trust me, it's hard for me to read them, but we must face this problem in order to address it. We must improve the data system related to murdered and missing Indigenous women to truly identify the scope of this problem. We must prioritize intergovernmental communication to reduce the lag time responding to these atrocities, and we must change the law enforcement protocols to improve the proactivity in combating violence against Indigenous women. We must take action so this does not keep going. Today, we're going to hear some invaluable testimony from experts who are fighting on the front lines of this battle, and what is working, what is not, and what we can do here in Congress to end this cycle of violence. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cook, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing is focused on a very, very difficult subject, but a very serious issue faced by Native communities and especially Native women. Crime and violence, tragically, are not a new phenomenon in Indian country. The Department of Justice has emphasized making law enforcement in Indian country a priority because American Indians are victims of violent crimes at rates higher than the general population. Compounding the problem is the fact that many tribal communities are found in remote, rural areas where tight tribal police budgets make timely and effective response to crimes on a reservation that much more challenging. There also appears to be a consensus among experts that the trend of high rates of domestic violence against Native women continue, despite the enactment of 2 major laws since 2010 to tackle this problem. I'm speaking of the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 and the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013, of which I was pleased to support and vote for, known as VAWA. While reliable, timely data concerning crime and law enforcement in Indian country can be hard to come by, depending on the scope and methods of each report on the topic, all have shown there is a problem plaguing tribal communities. I'm pleased that the Department of Interior has included in its budget proposal a new initiative to combat crime, specifically against Native American women in Indian country. It would be helpful, and we talked about this in the future, to have witnesses representing the Department of Interior and Justice to hear us tell us what the officers and federal prosecutors are doing about missing and murdered Native women. But I don't believe we have any here today. And the other reason is, quite frankly, they could get the message that we're very, very concerned about that. And all of us think that we need more funding in these vital areas to perhaps correct that problem. Given the complicated jurisdictional issues in Indian country, we must ensure that all at the table are working to reduce these types of crimes. And I want to thank the chairman for allowing me to testify. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cook, and I look forward to working with you in this Congress to move this along and bring some justice to our Indian country. Now I will introduce our expert witnesses for today. Our first witness is Sarah Deer. She's a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation, lawyer and professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Phoenix. And also, she has just recently been inducted into National Women's Hall of Fame. Congratulations, and thank you for being here. Next is going to be the Honorable Ruth Buffalo, citizen of the, and I apologize, of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, and member of the North Dakota State House of Representatives. Well, you're welcome, Your Honor. I apologize if I messed up any of those names and titles. Our next witness is Mary Kathryn Nagle, member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and legal counsel to the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And finally, our last witness is Tammy, an Athabascan mother of 4 and executive director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Thank you all for being here. Let me remind witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire written statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we begin questioning of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Sarah Deer to testify.
Good morning. The Honorable Chairman Raul Grijalva, Ranking Member Rob Bishop, Chairman Ruben Gallego, Ranking Member Paul Cook, and members of the committee. I would like to express my deep appreciation and thanks for inviting me to testify before this subcommittee on missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW. I am a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma and currently hold a position as professor at the University of Kansas. I also serve as the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. Today, I am testifying in my personal capacity. My testimony today will focus on our knowledge in terms of the high numbers of MMIW, and I will offer some theories about the causes of the high rates, and finally, a few suggestions on how Congress can improve law enforcement's response to this crisis. I'd like to mention the names of 4 of my fellow tribal members from the Muskogee Creek Nation. Farron McGirt, missing 1999. Peggy McGuire, missing 2015. Ruth Ann McGirt Stoller Rex, murdered in March 2015. And Margie Childers, whose body was just found 2 days ago in Oklahoma. I think it's critical to understand that the crisis that we're talking about today has deep roots in the historical mistreatment of Native people throughout the history of the United States. Native women and girls have been disappearing literally since 1492, when Europeans kidnapped Native people for shipment back to Europe. Targeted killing of Native women is also not a recent phenomenon. The history of oppression makes it difficult to achieve buy-in from marginalized communities who have been victims of oppression at the hands of the federal government. When crafting solutions, we have to be ready to accept that there will be no quick fix to this problem. The crisis has been several hundred years in the making and will require sustained, multi-year, multifaceted efforts to understand and address the problem. I want to mention an organization called the Sovereign Bodies Institute, which has been collecting the names and stories of MMIW in the United States. Currently, that database has over 1,870 names. Now, there's many questions about why these rates are as high as they are. In my written testimony, I mentioned several factors, including jurisdictional barriers, indifference from government officials, the lack of cross-jurisdictional communication and planning, the failure to adequately fund tribal justice systems, and the problem of sex traffickers and other predators targeting Native women specifically. Now, we know that jurisdictional questions are always at the forefront of any question about crime in Indian country, and this is no different. There's a variety of legal jurisdiction questions that immediately arise when a tribal member goes missing. Did they live on the reservation? Did they disappear from the reservation? Did they disappear off the reservation? What agency has jurisdiction? Does the tribe have concurrent jurisdiction? So we need to have some resolution to these questions. I want to now move to a more difficult factor, which is the predatory targeting of Native women and girls. While most women victims of homicide in the United States are killed by someone they know, there is sufficient evidence that there are predators who target Native women and girls for trafficking. In 2010, law enforcement officers in Alaska determined that Alaska Native girls and women who travel to Anchorage are often targeted by sex trafficking rings, in part because of their marketability in the sex trade. FBI agent Jolene Godin explained, Native girls are targeted in part because they're considered versatile, meaning they can be advertised on the internet as Hawaiian or Asian. An Anchorage-based sex trafficker named Troy Williams, who was finally convicted after years of targeting Alaska Native teenage girls who were struggling with rough childhoods, poverty, and addiction. He trapped victims in the sex trade through brute force, including sadistic beatings, icy baths, and sleep deprivation. In Canada, an investigation by reporters for Globe and Mail newspaper concluded that Indigenous women in Canada, which is a similar history, are 7 times more likely than a non-Indigenous woman to die at the hands of a serial killer. Thank you for allowing me to testify today. I am hopeful that new attention on a very old problem will finally begin to stem the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women. As a nation, I believe we are better than this. Please support the families of MMIW to find their loved ones and bring them home.
Thank you, Professor. Next, we have the Honorable Ruth, I apologize, the Honorable Ruth Buffalo, State Representative from North Dakota, House of Representatives, 27th District.
Hello. Madzigadads, Gadagute Sagids, good morning. Nido Shadzi, Nakbaga O, Madashi, Mia Adesh Heads. My name is Ruth Buffalo, Woman Appears. Thank you. It's an honor to be here in front of you to share about this important topic. I'm a member and a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation and descendant of the Chiricahua Apache. Currently, I am representing District 27 in South Fargo. I am a newly elected member to the House of Representatives in North Dakota, the 66th Legislative Assembly. I want to share a little bit further about my tribal heritage. In our communities, in the Hidatsa specifically, we are a matriarchal society, and so the women pass on the clans. So I'm a member of the Dripping Earth clan. So as you can tell, when we lose our women, it's a huge hit on our entire community. We still hang on to some of these matriarchal traditions, such as our women sitting during prayer while our men stand, because the men have such great respect for our women. I have introduced 4 legislative bills which address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people in human trafficking. And I also want to acknowledge the good work that has been done by former Senator Heidi Heitkamp with regards to missing and murdered and also human trafficking. In addition, I have brought forward a study resolution to further examine the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people and human trafficking, and a resolution urging Congress to pass Savannah's Act. This legislation has passed through the North Dakota House and now awaits action in the North Dakota Senate. It's important to note that the legislation introduced in North Dakota is non-gender specific, as we wanted to include all genders in using the language missing and murdered Indigenous people. House Bill 1311 seeks law enforcement training and others, and House Bill 1313 as amended would create a state repository on missing people, including the Indigenous population. House Bill 1507 and 1541 will provide human trafficking prevention and awareness training to hotels, establishments, and schools. House Bill 1311 would provide training for state's attorneys and law enforcement officers and officials regarding missing and murdered Indigenous people. The training would be provided by the North Dakota Human Trafficking Commission, which is comprised of key stakeholders from tribal, state, and federal agencies and organizations and government. House Bill 1313 would create a state repository for missing persons, including Indigenous populations. This bill comes with a fiscal note of $75,000 to update the software of this criminal justice information system within the Attorney General's office. In addition, this bill would address the need for accuracy in data collection of missing and murdered Indigenous people. I wish I had more data to share with you, but the fact that I don't is part of the reason why I'm here. As a resident of Fargo, North Dakota, I found myself on the front lines of the search for Savannah in August of 2017. Elder women from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa asked me to lead the search the following day. In our culture, when someone asks you to do something, you don't say no, especially if a female elder makes the request. We began the search on August 27th, my birthday. Later that day, kayakers found the body of the deceased Savannah Graywind in the Red River. From that day forward, our eyes were opened to the very real threat before us, and we formed a local task force in the Fargo-Moorhead area dedicated to preventing such tragedies from ever happening again. And we thought if and when this should ever happen again, we didn't want to waste time in having to convince law enforcement that we are human beings and that we deserve justice. There must not be any more stolen sisters. We simply cannot tolerate losing any more sisters in this way. From my experience of being a volunteer searcher, it has led me to find solutions. I thought of how Savannah was an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe, but grew up in Fargo, off of the reservation. From the start of the search, I wanted federal agencies to become involved. After all, she was a member of the federally recognized tribe. The realities of the situation dictated that we must work with local authorities when instances occur outside of the reservation. One thing that will forever ring in my mind is attending the trial and hearing one of the murderers hear what he said that day to the police. He told the police, she always goes missing, or she's always taking off. Her parents were just here last week looking for her when we knew this statement was false, but it raises many questions. Did this comment sway law enforcement or not into taking swift action? That is why we continue working for justice and for healing our communities. Some of the recommendations that I would like to quickly mention is a national inquiry with hearings held throughout the United States in rural and urban areas to go to the very communities that suffer the loss of their loved ones, to include language of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people into the scope of work within the Office of Violence Against Women and the Office of Victims for Crime. As a public health professional and researcher, I know data tells a story. Without data, there's no clear evidence that a problem exists. Hundreds of communities hold stories of truth from generation to generation. Our communities know which relatives have yet to return to their families. We must help tell them. We must help have those stories told by giving them tools and resources to do so, and eventually bringing the lost ones home. Madzigidads, and thank you for allowing me to testify before you.
Thank you, Representative. Next, we'd like to introduce Ms. Mary Kathryn Nagle. She's legal counsel of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Gallego, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Paul Cook, and all other members of the committee. Thank you so much for inviting me here today and for your time and consideration of this very important issue. I'm honored to represent as legal counsel to the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, a national nonprofit dedicated to the restoration of tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction to protect and save the lives of Native women and children. The NIWRC has played a critical role in raising awareness around the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis here in the United States today. The NIWRC has hosted numerous educational trainings, briefings on the Hill. They've hosted screenings of educational films, held candlelight vigils, and collaborated with local grassroots organizations to generate support for a national day of awareness for missing and murdered Native women and girls. Our main office is in Lame Deer, Montana, and so our staff directly experienced the losses of both Henny Scott and Hannah Harris. This is a crisis that strikes at home, and it strikes deep. In September of 2018, the NIWRC hosted a candlelight vigil at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. We were honored that Congresswoman Gwen Moore came and spoke about the importance of the restoration of tribal jurisdiction, supplementing with tribal resources to tribal law enforcement, and compelling the federal government to take this issue seriously and investigate and prosecute cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women. But probably the most impactful moment of that candlelight vigil was when Florence Choyo spoke and shared the story of her daughter Monica, who was murdered during a domestic violence action in the Keams Canyon on the Hopi Reservation. As to myself, I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm an attorney, and I'm a direct descendant of a tribal leader, my great-great-great-grandfather, who in the 1820s, as Speaker of our tribal council, worked to create and establish our Cherokee Nation Supreme Court and pass a law that criminalized the rape of any woman on Cherokee lands, regardless of the identity or race, citizenship of the perpetrator. I'm a direct descendant of a tribal leader who understood the connection between tribal sovereignty and safety for Native women, and that understanding informs and commands the work that I undertake today. I think all of our written testimony, the testimony of my colleagues today, underscores the depth of this crisis, the fact that our women are murdered 10 times the national rate on reservations. In addition to that incredibly high rate of violence, we also know that the majority, this is from a statistic from the DOJ, National Institute of Justice, the majority of violent crimes committed against Native women are committed by non-Indians. So even though our members of our own nations and our communities are committing these crimes, we have a huge crisis of non-Indian perpetrated violence against Native women. And because in 1978 the Supreme Court eliminated tribal jurisdiction, this has only exacerbated the crisis that, as Professor Deere mentioned, has been accumulating over hundreds of years since 1492. However, when we look at the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, the jurisdictional loophole is a major source of the high rates of violence against our women and the lack of a response. Because of this Supreme Court decision in 1978 and the current legal framework for a tribal nation to undertake and arrest and prosecute a perpetrator who has murdered or kidnapped a Native woman, the tribal government must, for jurisdictional purposes, determine that the identity of the perpetrator is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, an Indian. And if they cannot determine that, that paralyzes tribal law enforcement and a tribal government from working to protect their own citizens. This is the case so often. It was the case with Olivia Lone Bear. When she went missing in October of 2017, her tribal nation could not determine whether or not it had jurisdiction simply because they could not identify the identity of the perpetrator. And although her brother, Matthew Lone Bear, repeatedly demanded that all state, tribal, and federal officials act immediately to locate her and to search for her, it wasn't until 10 months later, after he'd been asking for 10 months for the federal authorities to search all bodies of water on the reservation, that they found her deceased in her truck at the bottom of Lake Sakakawea. So often when one of our women or girls goes missing, it is our family members and our friends who undertake the search to rescue her, not law enforcement. That has to change. So it's not only a jurisdictional issue, it's the lack of response from the federal authorities who oftentimes, under the current legal framework, do have jurisdiction and yet do nothing. Another major issue that I've written much about in my written testimony and what the NIWRC recommends is more access to the National Criminal Information System, NCIC. Currently today, only 47 tribal nations have access to this database. This database is a critical tool anytime a Native woman goes missing or is murdered for justice. And right now, the lack of access that tribes have, with only 47 of the 573 federally recognized tribes having access, is a huge impediment. Finally, lack of resources. So many of our tribal nations do not have adequate funding for their own law enforcement, as well as victim services. As the NIWRC has stated publicly for many years and advocated, we are working so hard to fund victim services because we have to deal with the crisis of domestic violence and sexual assault. Oftentimes, those crimes escalate to murder and homicide. So we need funding for our victim services and our tribal law enforcement. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Wadon.
Thank you, Ms. Nagle. Next, we have Ms. Tammy Giroux. She's the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center.
Tammy Truitt Giroux, I have to push that? Okay. Thank you for inviting me to testify on this important issue today. I'm an enrolled citizen of a small Degaton Athabascan village in the interior of Alaska. I'm a mother, a grandmother, an auntie, as well as the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW, is a far too common occurrence and recently has received much attention due to the many raised voices having put the issue in the public eye. Unfortunately, MMIW didn't just start happening a few years ago, but it's been happening since the first contact. There are many stories and experiences of Alaska Native women and girls that have faced victimization just because they're Indigenous. Too many of our relatives have suffered abuse and death because of a government system that fails in their legal trust and moral responsibility to assist Indigenous nations in safeguarding the lives of our women and children. There are many stories, such as the 20-year-old Sophie Sergi, who traveled to Fairbanks from her small Yupik village in western Alaska in 1993. She went to visit her friend at the University of Alaska. She left the room to go outside and never returned. She was eventually found, sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, shot in the back of the head in a dormitory bathroom. Unfortunately, for 25 years, there had been no justice. And until recently, a DNA was linked from a genetic genealogy site, which uses family genetic history to find suspects. The DNA was linked to a student who attended the university in the 1990s and is now a nurse working in Maine. Finally, an arrest was made for this heinous crime 25 years ago. However, often we have no choice and no closure with many of our women who die unexpectedly and unnaturally. The manner of death, while it is far too often considered suspicious and often with visible injuries, is classified as accidental, suicidal, or undetermined. In the village of Cloac, police suspected foul play and the unnatural death of Francine Ella Turpin, 37, on January 14, 2018. A year later, there is no resolution. Why is it that our women and families do not get the closure regarding cause of death that the general population takes for granted? Maybe because 40% of our communities have no law enforcement or even have 911 services to speak of. So who do they call? The first responders are often volunteer medics who their first inclination is to address the injury. The possibility that there could be a crime committed is not even contemplated, and the scene can easily be contaminated before a semi-qualified individual can preserve the scene. Often, first responders are the tribal chief or volunteer advocates who are tasked to preserve crime scenes. Why do our women and girls go missing or murdered at such high rates? I believe that's a simple but complicated question. The tragic truth is that the impact of colonization, past and current laws and policies, and natural resources development have endangered Alaska Native women and girl children. Oftentimes, the attitude of people coming into our lands is that the lack of infrastructure, such as local police and services, normally in place that offer protection and justice systems to hold perpetrators of crimes accountable, do not exist in our tribal communities. A mixed message is sent that it is okay to commit crimes against Native people and there will be no consequences. Sadly, the long history and belief that Native people are less valuable and a barrier to land and resource development, and American Indian and Alaska Native women who are objectified and considered of little importance. As for the missing and murdered persons and homicides of Alaska Natives, Alaska has the highest number of any state, and these are not per capita numbers. Areas that would help decrease these statistics is to continue funding organizations such as ourselves, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, we are developing a community engagement toolkit to address when a person goes missing or dies by unnatural death. This plan will help tribal communities respond. We cannot wait for the state or federal government to act. We need a jurisdictional fix in Alaska's Indian country issue in which 228 out of 229 tribes are without territorial jurisdiction and regular and consistent tribal justice and tribal law enforcement funding in Alaska through the Indian Tribal Support Act. The bipartisan group of co-sponsors in the Senate has introduced Savannah's Act, S227, which includes several provisions aimed at improving the response to the cases of missing and murdered women in tribal communities. However, how it's written now would exclude half of the tribes in needs to address Alaska tribes particularly. Provide sufficient federal support for effective and culturally appropriate services to Indigenous women, survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, including to the provision of victim services, rape crisis, and transitional housing. When Indigenous women do not have adequate services and safe housing, they are placed at risk. Provide permanent access to the Crime Victims Fund for victims' assistance and compensation. The House needs a bill similar to the Senate's Survive Act. Fully implement VAWA 2005 program of research and specifically regarding the disappearance and murders of Native women. We need a baseline study for Alaska, as statistics prove our situation is worse and maybe different than lower 48. And finally, support tribal amendments to HR 1585 VAWA reauthorization, including a pilot project similar to the one created in VAWA 2013, wherein Alaska tribes can exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. There is a unique opportunity to recognize these issues and make corrections to the laws to support the nation's First Peoples. Dogaden.
Thank you so much to all of our witnesses. Great. Again, I want to thank the expert witnesses for their powerful testimony, reminding members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a five-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask of the witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for the first 5 minutes, and we will alternate to our ranking member and go on from there. Thank you again for the witnesses. This has been, I think, very difficult for many of us to listen, but very much necessary. Professor Deere, in your testimony, you mentioned the Sovereign Bodies Institute, a nonprofit Native-owned and operated organization. What is the importance of having organizations such as SBI work on data gathering projects related to MMIW? And two, how accessible is this information to federal agencies?
Thank you for that question. I believe that it's critical that Native people are at the forefront of this effort. Even if we were to receive federal funding, it still should be that tribal members and families and survivors should drive the data collection. And one of the reasons is for cultural reasons. If someone is going to add a name of a missing loved one to a data set, there's sometimes a need for ceremony, feasts that are associated with that. So if it's the federal government collecting the data, they're not necessarily in the position of providing that. And so we do need, while federal data would be helpful, I really believe that the forefront should be led by Indigenous women, survivors, and their families. I think that nonprofits can partner with federal agencies, but it needs to be on the terms of the Indigenous people at the forefront. And that will help our families feel comfortable in coming forward and sharing their story. And sometimes it's been decades and they don't believe anyone cares anymore. So we need to do that outreach that requires grassroots efforts.
Thank you, Professor. Representative Ruth Buffalo. Representative, you spoke about the progress of your bills on the issue in the North Dakota legislature. In my home state of Arizona, a bill to improve data on missing and murdered Indigenous women just unanimously passed the House this week and is headed to the state Senate. Can you speak to why it's important to address this crisis at a federal level as well as the local level like you are trying right now?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, it's very important that all levels of government pay attention to this issue because we have a larger population that also lives off of the reservation or off of the exterior, outside of the exterior boundaries of an Indian reservation. So that is why we are focusing on a state level to make sure that we implement mechanisms that will tell a story and will show that evidence that there is an issue here and that we need to pay special attention to this epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Ms. Giroux, how does MMIW issue differ for Alaska tribes versus tribes in the lower 48? And how do these differences impact your attempts to address the issue?
There's many jurisdictional differences in Alaska compared to the lower 48 tribal communities. And those jurisdictional issues have impact in a couple of different ways. A lot of our tribes are very isolated. We have 229 tribes. Only one is federally recognized as a reservation, and that's Metlakatla. And because of that, the 228 tribes are under the jurisdiction under PL 280 with concurrent jurisdiction with the state of Alaska. So they're tasked for their law enforcement and jurisdictional and justice systems through the state of Alaska. At this point, because of the isolation of the tribes and the differences in terms of distances, the cost of those distances, it has created a mess in terms of the fact that there's very difficult times. I know that Joel Jackson, who you referred to from the native village of Cake, often tells the story that they'll get faster response for a killing of a moose out of season than they will of a native woman. And unfortunately, that's not just a story. And the problem is that law enforcement, the lack of law enforcement and justice systems in our communities really does create a crisis in terms of living in our isolated communities. Unfortunately, we also have a large number of Native people that live in the cities of Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau and other what they call hub communities. And the response there tends to be, I don't want to, oftentimes Native women, if they have other issues, are often not taken seriously, especially if there's been some kind of crime against them, and there's oftentimes many crimes against them. I think we have very vulnerable population in the cities. And unfortunately, then law enforcement's response also lacks any real care oftentimes.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. And now I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Mr. Cook, for his first question.
Thank you very much. And once again, I want to thank witnesses. I notice, I see Wilson Pipeston in the audience a number of years ago. Went down to Cherokee, North Carolina, where there was a play, a Native American play, that I think he was the star of. Maybe he was, I don't know. But it was a great, great play to emphasize VAWA, violence against women. And some of these things to outsiders, that they don't see that. You know, I think some of the things that you underscored, we're all concerned about. And in the back of my pea brain, I'm trying to figure out, boy, this is horrible, this is terrible. Now, how are we going to correct this so that we do this? And we talked about the differences, and people are concerned about confidentiality and everything else. I think identifying the problem, getting law enforcement, all those things. A database. There was a woman, I can't remember her name, I think her last name was McNamara. She was not a police officer, but she wrote a book about what she did in these killings in California, all over the place. And this one person, when you look at this, just when she passed away, unfortunately, and then her book became a bestseller, or at least it was not. And I'm trying to think, and almost what I want from you. I understand the anecdotes and the emotion and everything else. What I'm hoping is that the collective wisdom here, that you give us a battle plan where we can kind of turn it into action in terms of constructive laws and policies that unite everybody. Oh, I just found out you wrote the play.
I was trying to be subtle.
Hey, I'm just a dumb Marine up here.
You got two dumb
And Wilson, you weren't that good, and you never liked the bear meat that they served that night. So, but what I'm looking
about to roll you out over here.
it's not fair being in the minority right away. But I think you got a lot of supporters. As I said, I voted for VAWA. What I need, and I'm not an attorney or anything else, I just want to do something in terms of how we can do. It's going to be very, very difficult because just the circumstances and everything else. But you've got right on your side here. You got history on your side. You're absolutely. I'm a historian, so. And I was not alive, Wilson, in 1492, although some of my colleagues think so. So I'm hoping that maybe we might have another round on this, where we have justice and the other one, partly because I not only want their input, I want them to hear this testimony. And the more advocates that we have, this is a huge problem. It's not going away. And that how we can correct this and get something done. So thank you, Ms. Nagle. I want to apologize. And I want to thank the chairman for embarrassing me in front of everybody.
To reclaim my time, that was my attempt to help you from embarrassing you. But this is certainly not going to be the last time we address this, because this is a serious, serious problem. And when thousands of our U.S. Citizens, our sisters, go missing, it is irresponsible for us to not do something. With that, I'd like to move on to next round of down dais here, and to Representative Cartwright for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to take a moment to thank Chairman Gallego for calling this important hearing, and also to my new colleague, Congresswoman Holland, who raised this issue in her campaign. In fact, she called MMIW an epidemic in her campaign, and I think she's right. So thank you, Chairman, for calling this hearing. My understanding, and if I'm mistaken, please correct me, my understanding is that victims of violence in tribal communities are often reluctant to report and share information about crimes, and that part of this is tied to the historical relationship between settlers and indigenous communities, and that this is a particularly strong barrier in rural communities. And Professor, and I want to say Chief Justice Deere, can you give us some examples of what these historical concerns are, how it plays out in present times, and I'm particularly interested in the difference between rural and urban communities.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think the historical mistrust that many Native people have in law enforcement is well-founded. I think that the history of law enforcement in Indian country has not been one of necessarily protection, but one of persecution. And when you are a Native woman and your sisters and your aunts and your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother have all been victims of violence and nobody's done anything, why would you come forward? And I think that trust has to be built, and it's not going to happen in one bill, and it's not going to happen in 1 year. That trust is going to take years and years and years to rebuild. I think the challenge in the urban environment is that Native women, particularly if, she is not the perfect victim like Elizabeth Smart or Drew Chodine that get on CNN primetime. If she's had an addiction problem or she's been homeless or maybe her children have been taken from her, and you go to urban or off-reservation police departments, oftentimes families tell us there's just a shrug and well, what did you expect? And at that point, then the family is left feeling as though nobody cares. And so both on reservation and off reservation, we need to develop and cultivate a culture of compassion and a culture of understanding. And that's not something you can easily do through legislation, but I believe with the leadership of Congress, we will begin to see a sea change in that problem.
Thank you. And Representative Buffalo, you spoke about a couple of issues that I'm interested in, data and training. On data, we're interested in ways that these concerns can be overcome. What you said in your testimony, I wrote it down, without data, there is no clear evidence that a problem exists. So what can we do to improve our data collection systems? For example, you suggest in your testimony that the language of MMIW be included in the scope of work for the Office on Violence Against Women and the Office for Victims of Crime. What I'm after here is, can you give us specific examples of language that you think should be used?
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright and members of the committee. It's unfortunate that we have to have the ask to include the language of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and people. So I will say that first and foremost. But also, our efforts on the ground level, at the grassroots level, are grassroots and for prevention. How can we prevent these tragedies from further occurring? But we do have to address the existing structures and what systems are currently in place. So we do need to include, we believe, this language of missing and murdered Indigenous people. At the state level, what we found in digging deeper into the data collection statewide is that North Dakota does not currently collect any data on missing people. Right. So that was...
Well, we'll talk further about the
Okay.
language.
Okay.
And I thank you for the suggestions. I also understand you proposed legislation to conduct training for law enforcement in your legislature. What are some of the topics that you think this training should focus on?
So, Mr. Cartwright and members of the committee, at the state level with the training, we are tapping into existing structures such as the North Dakota Human Trafficking Commission. So that commission is comprised of different experts in the field. So this legislation is giving that body the freedom to provide that training to law enforcement. Within that commission, the Human Trafficking Commission, there's members of the First Nations Women's Alliance who have established and built relationships throughout North Dakota and the region. So some of this training would look at perhaps cultural competency training, understanding the differences within tribes, some that are matriarchal, and just understanding, also trying to find ways to build trust and to work towards healing and justice in our communities.
Thank you so much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Cartwright. I'd like to now recognize Chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Congressman Perreault.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, both of you. This hearing has been very powerful and very necessary, and I want to thank the witnesses for their insight, their expertise, and more importantly, for humanizing what we're talking about today. It is not merely, as someone said, one of the witnesses, a question of numbers or where they fit in. It's a question of lives, and I appreciate it. I think one of the things that full committee and that all of us have participated in is that one of the missions is to bring voices and attention to issues that have not had their voices or garnered the attention that those issues demand. And your subcommittee, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, have done that. And this is a good example with this hearing. I appreciate it very much. All of us do. Let me just a couple of questions, if I may. Council, Ms. Nagle, at yesterday's Violence Against Women's Act markup at the committee, an amendment was offered that would strip tribes of their inherent authority to prosecute non-Indian domestic violence offenders. I bring that up. It failed, unfortunately, on a party line vote, which on an issue of this significance, as the ranking member indicated, it requires that everybody be involved in it, and that if there is a bipartisan issue this Congress can find, it's certainly here, and it's certainly at this subcommittee. And I want to know, how's that going to impact the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, if you don't mind?
Thank you, Chairman. Yesterday's proposed amendment was very disappointing to see. The reauthorization of VAWA in 2013 with the restoration of tribal criminal jurisdiction over crimes, non-Indian perpetrated crimes of domestic violence, dating violence, and criminal violation of protection orders was a huge step to saving more lives. There are Native women today who have stated publicly and will continue to do so that since the restoration of tribal criminal jurisdiction over those 3 crimes in 2013, their lives have been saved. And had that jurisdiction not been restored, their tribal government would not have been able to intervene and prosecute the domestic violence crimes or the violations of their protection order and save their lives. We know that. We know that tribal jurisdiction, giving the government closest to the ground to Native women to prosecute these crimes and protect them and their children, is the best form of security a Native woman can have. So it's very disappointing to see. And also, I will say, in addition to just it being disappointing that anyone would even suggest rolling back this progress that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, is the only statement that was made in support of the amendment was that simply tribal jurisdiction and prosecuting of non-Indians in tribal courts is unconstitutional. That was the same rhetoric that was given in 2013 against VAWA. That's based on a prejudicial view that tribal courts must be incompetent and cannot fairly adjudicate the rights of non-Indian defendants. The 5-year NCAI report, which came out documenting the first 5 years of the implementation of 2013 restored criminal jurisdiction, shows that in that first 5 years, not a single non-Indian defendant, despite numerous cases from numerous tribes, filed a habeas corpus petition, or lodged any formal complaints about any rights violations in tribal courts. So these are prejudicial beliefs that are not founded on any actual facts and reality. And at the end of the day, the concern is just, if the tribal jurisdiction is stripped away, that will put more.
what the motivation is for, but that's another question. Ms. Deere, all the witnesses in their own way reference the fact that the urban residents, indigenous folk, tribal affiliation, and their role in this process. Do you urban Indian centers like the Tucson Indian Center, where I'm from, in a tribal center, as pieces of legislation related to the issue we're talking about? Are they important conduits, important affiliations? Anybody wants to.
I believe, yes, that urban centers, urban Indian centers should be included in all of our discussions around this. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and my father was on the board of the first American Indian Center there in Wichita. And I know that was sort of a place of refuge for many people, and a place where people could find one another. And I think if we're talking about who's going to be eligible for funding, should funding be appropriated for this crisis, I think we should consider the possibility that urban Indian centers be provided with funding so that they can support the families in the urban areas.
Thank you, and thank you for the indulgence. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now it's my pleasure to pass to Representative Holland for her questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you so much for having this hearing. It's extremely important. Before I get started, I just wanted to ask you to explain the significance of the cloth that you have on the table.
Representative Holland and members of the committee, the skirt was handmade by an individual by the name of Agnes Woodward. She is originally from Canada and is married to a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Rikara Nation. She's made, I believe, a handful of these skirts globally, and they represent our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, our sisters. And she was directly impacted by her aunt is among the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we wear these ribbon skirts in honor of our missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the ribbon skirts also are a sign, they represent prayer, because we are a prayerful people. Thank you. Madzigirats.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The silent crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women has been my top priority since long before being sworn into Congress, and I am appreciative that I'm here today to hear your testimony to help find solutions to this long overdue issue in Indian country. I'm wearing red today in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and so I wanted to mention that. Indigenous women deserve to be protected just like anyone else in this country. This is why I've been working diligently with my colleagues on bills to provide basic protections for women and programmatic support for tribal public safety, including the Survive Act, which increases resources for tribal victims assistance through the Crime Victims Fund, the Native Youth and Tribal Officer Protection Act to extend protections to children and law enforcement personnel involved in domestic violence incidents on tribal lands, and Savannah's Act to protect Native American women by increasing communication and accountability amongst state, tribal, and federal lines and address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I would like to personally thank each and every one of our witnesses here today who have provided testimony to move this conversation forward to protect our women. Yesterday, we had a prime example of how Native women have historically lacked representation and protections in the United States Congress, and how we must continue to fight for basic protections that are afforded to other groups of people. And our chairman mentioned this. As many of you know, during the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Markup hearing in the House Judiciary yesterday, Representative Sensenbrenner attempted to amend the bill to wipe out tribal jurisdiction to exclude tribes from prosecuting non-Indians who commit violence against women-related crimes against women on tribal lands. Although this corrosive amendment was rejected, the vote was split across party lines and speaks exactly to the issue we're working to highlight today. For any congressional leader to attempt to take away protections for not only women but Indigenous women at a time when we are just beginning to understand how deep-rooted and serious of an issue the severe lack of protections are for Native women is an abomination. As a member of the United States Congress, we all take an oath that we are bound by to support and defend the Constitution, a Constitution that acknowledges that tribal governments are sovereign nations. And I take this oath seriously because every congressional leader has a responsibility to uphold the federal government's trust responsibility. I just want to say thank you, Professor Deere, for raising the issue of colonization because it has wreaked havoc on our people. My Pueblo people are also matrilineal, and at times it seems that we're still living in colonization because women are excluded from so many things. Thank you, Representative Ruth Buffalo, for running and winning your seat. You were meant to serve, and I'm inspired by the vast amount of work that you've already done since you've been in your seat, so thank you so much for that. But all of your work is so important, and I'm grateful for every single thing all of you have done to raise this issue, and I want you to know that I stand behind you 100%.
I yield Representative Holland as much time as she desires.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll start out with a question for Ms. Giroux. Ms. Giroux, you also spoke of the jurisdiction issues, concisely referring to it as the jurisdictional maze. Do you feel this jurisdictional uncertainty often emboldens criminals to commit and recommit crimes on tribal lands without the fear of being held accountable? Does this criminal activity bleed over into urban areas as well?
I believe so, and this is my opinion. I believe that our jurisdiction, because of the land issue, which is extremely complicated, that I don't even have, we have weeks and months to talk about, is extremely complicated in Alaska. But in urban areas, there is an underlying, I think, culture that Native people, because of what was referred to earlier in terms of some of them not being perfect victims, end up finding themselves in situations that they're vulnerable, homeless, addiction, lack of jobs and housing. And oftentimes Native people in our communities are being brought into the urban areas because there's lack of jobs and housing, law enforcement, addiction types of services or medical services in our communities. And so they end up finding themselves in situations that they didn't plan to be in. And so law enforcement and justice systems, because those systems are overburdened with the just vast number of Native people that are in those systems, our child welfare systems, our court systems, our jail systems, and law enforcement systems are overburdened with Native citizens in Alaska in urban areas. And because of their vulnerability and because of what I spoke to, that oftentimes those vulnerabilities also speak to the fact that they're not being investigated, I think, appropriately. And they're also not being, when we talk about data, the data is not being collected on these issues because we know that data drives a lot of the funding that would help to mitigate some of the problems. And unfortunately, it's not my favorite subject, but it is a reality that we have to deal with. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And this question is for Professor Deere. In December, I attended the Senate oversight hearing on missing and murdered Indigenous women and heard from a young woman that law enforcement agencies and the FBI have continuously failed at investigating these crimes. I also heard this issue again from a young woman who visited my office. What should Congress do to ensure the FBI and local law enforcement are properly investigating these crimes and acting timely on the cases? And before you answer, I'd just like to raise the issue that the FBI got its start solving murders in Indian country, the Osage murders. And so it seems to me that it is perfectly logical for them to dig in on this issue and find a solution to it. So please answer.
Thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor to be asked a question by you right now. I think we need to require federal law enforcement, the transparency is needed, require federal law enforcement agencies to track the number of MMIW reported in their jurisdiction and include that in the required annual Tribal Law and Order Act reports that are already required. I think we should require our federal law enforcement agencies to share information about missing and murdered Indigenous women with tribal nations. So if a Native person goes missing in a city or outside tribal jurisdiction, then we would ask the respective tribal nations as sovereigns are entitled to know that their citizens are missing, and so that communication happening into the tribal leadership. We need federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, to start accurately logging race and tribal affiliation in their database of missing persons. And I think any new funding for federal agencies must require that they develop protocol for responding to missing persons cases with meaningful consultation with the tribal nations that they serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you to our witnesses. We are near the end of our hearing. Votes have also been called, and this is why some members have left, not just out of abundance of caution and not to be insensitive. I want to make sure to say that. I hope we all gain very valuable insights into the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, its tragic effects on Indigenous people and their communities, and what is being done or not done to combat this issue, and what we need to do in real-world legislative solutions. We need to find real-world legislative solutions. It is clear Indigenous women and girls and Native American communities are not receiving the support, attention, and resources long overdue to them to actualize both awareness and tangible solutions that they have been calling for. The federal government, us, must live up to its trust responsibility and work towards real legislative solutions in true partnership with Indigenous women on local, regional, and national levels to fully address what we have heard here today. In closing, let me again thank the expert witnesses for their valuable testimony and members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. And just for my personal note, I'm deeply sorry that we in Congress have not addressed this for so long. It is a tragedy, and it is a sin that we have done, and we need to do everything we can to fix this. Under Committee Rule 30, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.